I just really wanted to give everybody who's here tonight, and particularly the people being honored, a warm welcome. The Dart Center is one of the great institutions in the journalistic landscape. It does vital work in a world that unfortunately seems to need its presence more with each passing year. And we're really proud to be the home of the Dart Center here at Columbia Journalism School. So all of you in the room who are journalists, keep it up. You're doing the Lord's work, and we're proud to be at least a small part of your support system. Bruce, take it away. Thanks, everybody.
And again, thank you, Nick, for everything, not just tonight. Welcome now officially on behalf of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma to the 2013 Dart Awards for Excellence in Reporting Trauma. For those of you who are new to the Dart Center, and by those of you, I mean those of you here in the audience and also folks who will be watching the video of this, which will be on the Dart Center website. The Dart Center is a global resource for journalists who cover violence, conflict, and tragedy, ranging from family violence and street crime up to war and human rights. We do a wide range of programs, training, education, and research. One of the most enduring, in fact, the oldest of the Dart Center's projects are the Dart Awards, which go back now to 1994. Over the last few months, we have seen, unfortunately, some spectacular demonstrations of why it matters that journalists think hard about covering violence and tragedy and trauma. We put this event, the Dart Awards, on the calendar months and months ahead. We would not have known or predicted that in December there'd be the Newtown shootings, that a couple of weeks ago there'd be a bomb in Boston. Both of these events, not only costing lives, not only showing both the vulnerability of our society and the resilience of our citizens and institutions, but also demonstrating why a language for describing violence and its impact matters, why a vocabulary, why an ethical code, why journalism rooted in the science and ethics and deep craft of covering the worst things that can happen to people, why it all matters. When we planned this evening, we didn't know we'd be in the shadow of two catastrophes, bringing shock and horror, but also demonstrating the power of trauma-aware journalism, which the institution I represent, the Dart Center, has been trying to build for more than a decade now. Last week in this very room, we had a day-long symposium on the Sandy Hook shootings, and as well a bit on Boston, trying to tease out from journalists, from clinicians, from responders, from community leaders, the lessons that we as journalists here at Columbia Journalism School need to know. Those are big lessons, and that's one way of learning, unfortunately. But tonight we go about learning in a different way. Tonight we do it through celebration. We are here to celebrate and learn from the best, from journalists who have thrown themselves into being master reporters, listeners, narrators of both suffering and resiliency, and who know that the real story, all of tonight's winners, honorable mentions, all know that the real story begins when the cameras leave the room, when the sound trucks leave a town, when the suspect is hauled off in handcuffs. It's weeks, months, years later that the story really begins. And to pursue that kind of story, to bring the news that no one hears, and sometimes people don't want to hear, from the long aftermath of violence, that takes special commitment And that's why we're here. We're here to honor that and celebrate it and learn from it. We are also here, I should say, as we do every year, to celebrate and honor the Dart Foundation of Mason, Michigan, which provides the Dart Center's core funding and has supported the Dart Awards since 1994. The Dart Awards are now in their 19th year. And if we could please have a round of applause for the Dart Foundation, which made, all those years ago, began a unique commitment that has changed journalists and journalism around the world, and we're very grateful. I'd like now to welcome, in fact, I'll talk more about the Dart Awards, but I would like to welcome Jim Lammers from the Dart Foundation to say a few words and take it from there, and then I'll come back.
Thanks, Bruce. It's great to be here. We have had basically about a 20-year collaboration with people in the field. Our roots were originally at Michigan State University. I live in East Lansing, and a lot of Dart began in Michigan. And we were then at the University of Washington, and now we're here. And this feels like as good a home as you could find, I think. It's been a great move from our perspective. I've known Bruce for a long, long time. Bruce spoke at one of the early events we had on campus at Michigan State. And we had a lot to think about when we made the decision to move away from the University of Washington, and went through a lot of hard thinking, and Columbia kept being the yes, 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 yes. And I also want to thank Dean Lemon and Arlene Morgan and Bruce and others. It's a really good home and a great place to be. And I also want to sort of echo what Bruce has said, that you know, in my simple mind, I keep thinking about the Dart Center having two primary missions. You know, one is to encourage and recognize excellence in reporting on victims of violence, and the second is to better prepare journalism entities and their reporters who are covering beats that expose them to traumatic events in which they're often first responders in every sense of the word, to be better prepared and better debriefed and after they go through all of those. And to the winners, and tonight, it is a night of celebration for all the terrific work you've done. I did read all of the entries, and as I am every year, was struck by the depth and thought that went into the stories that were winners and honorable mention winners as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Okay, let me just give you a roadmap. We're going to have a brief ceremony at which we honor, give certificates, get Oscar speeches, all of that sort of stuff. That will be hopefully brief, just as at the Oscars. But then we'll move into the main event, which is a conversation about the making of this year's winners, to really go behind the stories of the extraordinary work. You're lucky. You're deeply privileged this year because you get a twofer, a double header. The Dart Awards are a team prize. We believe that it takes an organization-wide commitment to do this extraordinary work. And this year's teams are so big that we're actually going to break the conversation in two, of two news organizations about a half an hour, then another two news organizations about a half hour. So you actually are going to get two different conversations about different aspects of trauma journalism and trauma-aware journalism and in-depth reporting in the aftermath of tragedy. It's going to be very cool. Briefly on the Dart Awards. You should know that the Dart Awards do go back to 1994, were first established at Michigan State University by the Dart Foundation as an expression of its commitment to victims of violence, and that began a journey through the various issues that the Dart Center now deals with. This year, over 100 news organizations in all media entered serious work for the DART Awards. 100 organizations from all over North America. The DART Awards span all forms of media. There's not a newspaper award and a radio award. We just put the best work head to head. As I mentioned, it's a team prize. These 100 entries were judged first by a first-round panel of news professionals, all journalists, many of them past DART Center Ochberg Fellows, winners of DART Awards in years past, other journalists who've worked with us, and then went to a final round panel that is interdisciplinary. The final judges, it's a unique judging process because the final judges include not only journalists, but clinicians. Nancy Casson-Adams, who is the president-elect of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. Nancy, thank you for stepping out of her role as a clinician and into a new role as journalism judge, and victim advocates and others, in order to bring an unusual set of discussions, to talk about things that journalists may not always talk about themselves when considering the excellence of work. The first criterion is journalism excellence, journalistic excellence, but then we also look at the dignified representation of victims, the accuracy of scientific information that may be up front or in the background, the role of stories in educating the public about the long-term impact of violence and the nature of both trauma and resiliency. It's a very rich judging process that got us to this place. As I said, over 100 submissions, 12 were named finalists. Of those 12, 3 received honorable mentions, and 2 were named DART Award winners. It was really, really tough judging. I mean, all the judges this year came into the room saying, this is going to be really tough. And the distinctions between winners and honorable mentions are of no consequence in this room. All of the winners here today are all extraordinary journalists at the highest professional caliber, delving deeply with innovative techniques into the aftermath and impact of violence in ways that no journalist has really done before. This is a craft that's making itself up as it goes along. I'm going to begin with talking about the honorable mentions and handing out those awards, and then we'll go on to the winners, and then we'll have our little conversation. And I'd like to ask Jim and Claudia if you would join us up here, who they will hand out certificates to the various folks. The first group of certificates, the honorable mention will be for the York Daily Record for the story behind these hands. And you'll see some images, hopefully, rotating behind me as we go, if my colleague Ariel gets the technology to work, and there it goes. The York Daily Record from Pennsylvania, this was a carefully researched, impeccably researched, and eloquently written story weaving together the experiences of students and teachers exploring the lasting impact on one community 9 years after a 2003 shooting at Red Lion High School that left the principal and the shooter dead. Needless to say, this story really haunted me over the last few days as I was rereading all the entries in light of current events. It's a story that moves back and forth in time, that explores the perspectives of teachers and students and community, that asks all these years later why some people want to forget or choose not to remember or choose not to talk about it, and asks why some people must keep talking about it, can't get this horrible event out of their lives. It was an exceptional commitment. The judges cited the exceptional commitment of a local newspaper to a story of this depth and range. It was especially hard, I think, for a local paper to do, since local reporters must live with the consequences every day of their reporting. It's a small community in which those who speak, those who report, those whose images are in the paper are known to their neighbors. The team pursued the story carefully with great sensitivity and found that some people who weren't healing and that found that keeping quiet wasn't helping. And finally, there's a social media dimension. They invited the community to discuss this story via Facebook and Twitter. Fitter too, probably. Set up a live chat with the reporter, photographer, and editors, and honored the reader's response without getting lost in the kind of nastiness of flames and standard comments. And in a way that's unique in the years that I've been involved in this contest, they were successful in showing the range of impact, the range of effects that a traumatic event can have on people directly and indirectly involved. And particularly in light of the events at Sandy Hook, I am very proud that the York Record folks are getting an honorable mention this year. The team members, and again, the DART Awards are a team prize because we believe it does take an organization-wide commitment, are Bill Landauer, the reporter, Scott Blanchard, the editor, who is here. Scott, stand up, come up. Jason Plotkin, visual journalist, AKA photographer. Sir, come up. And Samantha Dellinger, graphic artist, who is not here with us this evening. Guys, if you want to come to the podium and have your Oscar minute.
Oscar, 30 seconds, because he needs 32. Thank you very much to the DART Center, the judges for the honor and for inviting us up here tonight. I was honored also to work with a journalist like Jason and Bill Landauer, who did a spectacular job reporting and writing this, and with our other visual people, Brad Jennings and Sam Dellinger. And I love Bruce's words about how this kind of journalism and this kind of work matters. I think we believe in that it really, really does matter. And we're not perfect, but we try very, very hard, and we will keep doing that. So thank you again.
Sorry, my mom lives in California and couldn't be here, so I told her I'd call her so she can listen. She's on. Mom, can you hear me? Can you? Okay. Just quickly, I just want to say thank you very much. It was a very long 6 months. Bill Landauer, the reporter, did things that I had never seen a reporter do, and I've worked with many reporters over the years. Tenacity and compassion and just an ability to just care about this story and truly believe that it would make a difference in a community. And when you, like was said earlier, we're in a small community. So I don't do anything that I can't go home and look at my daughters in the face and say, I did this today. So the journalism I do has to be above board, and it has to be real. So thank you guys for recognizing the work that we did, and we appreciate it. And Mom, good night. I love you.
All right. The next honorable mention, if the technology cooperates, is going to go to the New York Times At War blog for the writing of Thomas J. Brennan. And Thomas and James, if you could make your way up, I'll say some things. This is the first time the DART Award has gone to a blogger. But those of you who look at NewYorkTimes.com know that for some years now, the At War blog has been a unique vehicle for a kind of citizen journalism from within the ranks of the military. Voices, often first person, always thorough, thoughtful, exploring the issues faced by the women and men of the American military over the course of the last decade. This award goes in particular to Thomas J. Brennan, who suffered a traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan, where he was deployed in the U.S. Marines and was diagnosed with PTSD upon returning home. Offers a uniquely personal and clear-eyed account of military culture and life as a veteran. And we'll talk a little more about the extraordinary intimacy and revelatory nature of his writing. Judges called Thomas Brennan's work fresh, powerful, and profound. They recognize the wide-ranging and far-reaching impact his work has had on a generation of soldiers and their families. That was a very important part of the judges' conversation. Over and over, what came up was the sense that Thomas Brennan's writing had allowed other soldiers to speak, had given a name and a face and a voice to issues that so many in the military are dealing with now. Thomas Brennan is a U.S. Marine who was deployed in the Helmand province and then before that in Iraq and in Fallujah. Writing, he has described being his therapy, his a way of dealing not only with the stigma of PTSD, but with his own issues. He's also the military affairs reporter for the Jacksonville Daily News in North Carolina, now that he's no longer in the service. And the Times editors themselves selected Thomas Brennan's work on the psychological toll of killings as one of the top 10 at-war blogs in 2012. With him is his editor, James Dow. The team members, both Thomas J. Brennan, freelance writer, New York Times at-war blog, and James Dow, editor, New York Times at-war blog. Guys, please come to the podium, say what you like.
I'd be lying if I knew what I was supposed to say right now. Thank you to my mom, who's always believed in my writing, and my dad as well. Big thanks to Jim, who kept pushing me and pushing me and pushing me to dig deeper and tell the issues that are affecting the United States military right now. Thank you to the Dart Center for recognizing my work. This isn't for myself. This is for the 22 veterans a day that commit suicide. And this is for the one active duty service member a day who commits suicide. My parting words are, please listen to veterans. We each have a unique story. Not that anybody else's is less important, but we have a story that needs to be told, and there's 1.7 million of us from Iraq and Afghanistan that need to be listened to. Thank you very much.
Well, I just want to thank you all, thank the DART Foundation for this. It's a great honor for At War. We're just a teeny little blog that we all do part-time in mornings and evenings before we get to our work as daily reporters. I just want to say a couple things about Thomas. I was smiling inside as Bruce was describing how these awards have gone to journalists with great experience and skills in this area. When Thomas's work came to me, and frankly, this is the first day I've met Thomas, to be honest. He was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, was working at Camp Lejeune, was going to be medically discharged, had very little experience writing, and was still working on his BA online. And what he sent us was extraordinary in its honesty and its vividness, and I can take almost no credit for any of it. And it all really goes to him for being as courageous as he was to describe some of the things he did and some of the things he experienced. And I'd just like to say, and I do believe Bruce hit it on the head when he said this kind of writing makes a difference to veterans who have been through these experiences and who really gain strength from reading the types of things that Thomas has written. So thank you for recognizing that.
And again, we'll have an opportunity for a conversation with Thomas and James a little bit later. Final honorable mention goes to a team that is not here tonight, a group of folks from the Sunday New York Times Magazine for Did You Think About the 6 People You Executed? This was by Robert Worth. This was an extraordinary report examining both perpetrators and victims and a reversal of roles between perpetrators and victims in Libya in the aftermath of liberation, in which torturer turned into prisoner, in which sometimes prisoner turned into perpetrator, discussed a relationship between Nasser Salhoba, a former doctor who now was serving as the Free Libya Militia's chief interrogator, and the man who had tortured and killed his brother in one of Gaddafi's prisons. Both men talked openly about their anger and shame, desire for retribution, and the need to resist the temptation of revenge. What emerged was an intimate portrait of the effects of torture and trauma and survivor guilt, rich and complex on both the victim and the perpetrator. The team members, and again, no one unfortunately is in attendance, but we can honor them in any event, are Robert Worth, reporter and writer, Jihad Nagah, whose photos you see there, Joel Lovell, the editor, and David Vesey, the copy editor. I do regret that the team can't be with us tonight, but let's honor them with applause. Okay, the first, and we're actually remarkably close to schedule. We're now going to transition to the winners of the DART Award. The first team I'd like to introduce is from the Los Angeles Times, who are receiving the DART Award for standing up Davian's story. Folks, please join us. We have here in front of us Molly Hennessy Fisk and Barbara Davidson from the Los Angeles Times. Molly Hennessy Fisk, reporter, Barbara Davidson, photographer, whose images are behind us here. They were joined on this project by Drake Hikes, editor, Arkasha Stevenson and Don Kelson, videographers, Albert Lee, producer, and Mary Cooney, visuals editor. This was an extraordinary multimedia series telling the story of Davian Graham, who at 16 years old was shot and left paralyzed by a gang member merely for being black, a Latino gang member merely for being black. With dignity, insight, and compassion, the series documented his life over the course of the 5 years following that shooting, threaded in with the decisions he faced about what to say to whom about these terrible events. It's an extraordinary portrait of one survivor's attempt to come to grips not only with the experience of violence, but his own place in the community that produced it, with his own conflicted conscience and his own sense of his role in public life. Judges called Standing Up a tour de force resonating at the highest level of journalistic excellence. They praised both Hennessy Fisk, for her foresight and tenacity in writing, and for producing a textured, nuanced narrative that explains the randomness of violence and tapestry of different impacts. The judges also spent a lot of time on Davidson's photographs, called them transporting, and the multimedia component of this tremendous. Judges also recognized the sheer commitment of individuals at all levels of the newspaper, displayed despite ongoing turmoil in the industry. I want to spend a few minutes now watching a 6-minute multimedia piece that was part of the original package. There's a lot to say about it, and yet it speaks for itself. We may want to talk about it once we get to the Q&A, but it gives you a sense of the events, the issues, and the tone that this remarkable Los Angeles Times package evoked.
Saturday, 1/12/2008 at 16:57.
911?
Yeah, I'd like to report a drive-by shooting at the Calvary Baptist Church.
Okay, I'm getting an emergency call. What number? Hang on.
Hello?
Did he save you?
He said I just got shot. He just left home.
Okay, we're getting calls over on Peck Road near Calvary. Okay, we'll be sending the sheriff's and paramedics over there. 911, what's your emergency?
Yeah, there was a shooting on Peck Road.
See what happened?
Yeah, I kind of did, but I don't know if I want to really be involved.
911 emergency.
Yes, right here in Monrovia. Somebody shot somebody, on the side street.
Okay, did you see who did it?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. 911 emergency, can we help you?
I just saw someone got shot.
Did you see who did it?
Hey, huh?
Did you see who did it? Did you see anybody see it?
Huh?
Hello? Did anybody see who shot him?
Someone had to see it. I can understand they were afraid. The man who just shot me is staring into the side view mirror, looking back at me. His face, I know. I went to middle school with him.
911?
Hi, my name is Beth, and I am on Peck Road, in front of Calvary Church, and there's a young African-American gentleman who has been shot.
And where was he shot?
He doesn't know, but he can't move his legs.
I can't put my leg.
All right, just don't move him, okay? Don't move him. Talk to him. Talk to him. He's just passed out. Did it.
It was black on brown, brown on black, retaliation back and forth. I think there were six shootings over just a few month period. Davian was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong color skin.
At that time as a kid, we were getting shot at our age of 12 and 11 by Hispanic males that were older than us because we're black. Like, we were gang members and we weren't. You know, and then being that my family had involvement in some of the stuff, it's almost like this is what I'm set up to do. And it just cycle continues. I mean, when you're constantly told you're going to be a jailbird like your dad or you're going to be a crackhead like your mom, like, it makes you feel as if, dang, like, that's all I can amount to. It was a constant reminder of, I'm not going to be like everybody here. I'm not going to be another repeat. I'm not going to continue the cycle. I'm not.
The area is not, at that time, was an area you didn't stop in because of the crime activities that were going on there. I just was looking at the area and debating whether or not I should stop, or if I stopped, was I going to get harmed?
I had nightmares about getting shot since I was 12. Ever since I was little, I always felt as if something was going to happen to me. I had a feeling. And it was in front of my church. I never thought it would be in front of my church. I never in a million years thought I would get shot in front of my church.
I did for a while think about what if I had left a minute earlier than I did. I would have gone past there before he was shot. If I had left the house 5 minutes later, and he could have been dead. That's where I was supposed to be.
Wake up. He's talking to us. My mom was talking on Monday.
I remember a light shining, and I just remember going to sleep. It sucked that I had to be in the hospital under the circumstances that I did, but it actually gave me a chance to figure out who I was. I had time to think. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. Think. And that was the beginning of, the new me, the new way of life, at least. It's like almost as if I knew what I was going to be facing, but I didn't know. Then I woke up at Huntington Memorial, and I wrote the words, I forgive them. And that's all I could do, is keep moving forward from my life and what I need to do to keep my life going. Well, I come from a city where people don't talk. People are afraid of retaliation. People are afraid of being harassed by gang members. But in court, I'm not going to be afraid. That's not how I want to live. I won't spend a second of my time thinking about him coming to hurt me. I don't have anything against him. Even though he shot me, it's difficult to see another young man face a long time behind bars for the rest of his life. Like, he's affected by the same things I was affected by. Like, I know this is weird, but it's almost like we're all brothers. We all live in the same crummy apartments. We all live in the same crummy houses. We all live in the same dirty part of the city, by the sewers and the washes. I refuse to not care because they're not black. You have to recycle pain. You have to recycle pain and turn it into love, If I was going to be in a wheelchair, I wanted to be the best guy at it.
He made a choice to continue to live his life. He is going to do what he was meant to do, regardless of whether he can walk or he's got to roll from place to place. You can either choose to live your life, or you can choose to live in fear. What kind of life is it to live in fear?
We are very grateful for that work, and even more grateful to have Molly Hennessy Fisk and Barbara Davidson here tonight.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the Dart Center and especially to thank the editors who championed this project, which took a long time, nearly 5 years. The editor of the paper, Devon Maharaj, Megan Garvey, gosh, I feel like I'm doing an Oscar speech, for real. Drex Hikes, who took over at a late stage as editor, the multimedia, which you just saw, which Arkasha Stevenson and Albert Lee were responsible for in large part with Don Kelson. We have a great, if you have time to check it out, a great online presentation that was put together by Armand and Evan and Megan, using a lot of documents that we gathered hard copy, but that would never have been made use of without the online presentation. Pardon me. I don't mean to go on and make this a Julia Roberts Oscar speech, but I did want to make mention of, they had mentioned earlier that you work in Jacksonville. I used to work in Raleigh. I worked at a lot of other much smaller papers. Sorry, I just wanted to say that I'm very grateful that the LA Times gave us time and space to do this work, but I think that it's really important to note that this kind of work can be done in smaller places. I have a lot of respect for the work that the York paper did, and I just hope that this can go out on the website or go out through the Dart Center, that good work can be done in places large and small, that we have great resources. I'm very grateful for them, but I think I'd love to see more of these projects done at papers of all different sizes, papers, websites, that we all practice journalism, but that there are no limits on what can be done on this topic in particular. That, and I'm sorry to go on, but I've covered a number of these mass shootings, and we can talk about it more on the panel, but that a big point of standing up in Davian's story was that at the time of his case, there were more than 1,000 attempted murder cases being handled in Los Angeles County courts, more than 600 of them gang-related, and this was one. And there are attempted murder cases going on all over this country, and in New York and in other places, some of them gang-related in places you wouldn't even imagine would have gangs. So I'd love to see more of those stories told. Thank you.
I just quickly would like to thank the DART Foundation for hosting and supporting this type of journalism. Often these stories are underreported, and it's very difficult to get these stories told. So bravo to you. I thank you so much for that. Molly, this is so much for you. You fought so hard for this story over the past 5 years to make it come together, so we all thank you at the Times. And mostly this is for Davian, who was brave enough to tell us his story under what could have been very dangerous, a very dangerous set of circumstances for him. So bravo to Davian and all the other people that this has happened to who are brave enough to tell their stories to us journalists. Thank you.
Okay, and the final DART Award presentation of the evening is going to a collaborative team. Now, a little bit of history here. When the DART Award was established, it was a newspaper-only award back in 1994, and it was at that time kind of innovative to say it's a team prize, but we really felt that within, the DART Foundation and Michigan State University at that time really had the insight that I think is true, that it takes an organization-wide commitment. So that's remained in the rules ever since. What the rules did not foresee was an era of metastasizing partnerships between different kinds of media organizations. And so this year we've got a collaborative team, not only within one news organization, not only between two, but between 3 different news organizations. The collaborative team of Pro Publica, Fundación MEPI, which is a nonprofit investigative journalism center based in Mexico, and This American Life, the public radio program, received the DART Award for Finding Oscar, Massacre, Memory, and Justice in Guatemala, which was its name on the Pro Publica site, or What Happened at Dos Eras, which was the name of the extraordinary radio piece broadcast on This American Life. This was, well, I read a lot of interesting and challenging and important journalism, and I hear a lot of radio. If you read one story this year, this is now I'm getting more personal, but if you read one story this year, if you listen to one radio program, it should be Finding Oscar or What Happened at Dos Eras, which moved from the present day and the life of a Guatemalan immigrant in Massachusetts back 30 years to a civil war in which atrocities were committed and in which the consequences move forward in time and play out up unto the present day in the life of a single individual who discovers that his past was not what he thought it was. This comprehensive multi-platform project centers on Oscar Ramirez Castañeda, a Guatemalan immigrant who at 32 learns he is not the son of a heroic military officer but was abducted at age 3 by an officer whose commando unit massacred 250 people in the jungle village of Dos Eras. While Oscar's mother and 8 siblings died, his real father had survived and was still alive. Weaving together perspectives of witnesses, survivors, and perpetrators with vast amounts of historical documentation, Finding Oscar and What Happened at Dos Eras uncover the truth surrounding one of the worst crimes in Guatemala's bloody civil war and portray the shadow of historic atrocity with exceptional depth and psychological nuance. The judges called Finding Oscar and What Happened at Dos Eras wonderfully gripping and utterly remarkable in its complexity, engagement, and impact. They praise the variety of delicately balanced storytelling techniques, astute interviewing, and the range of voices and perspectives that created a riveting and revealing narrative about perpetrators, victims, and justice, as well as a kind of biographical mystery story unfolding before our eyes and ears. They commented on the unusual strength of the online radio multimedia components and commended the transnational and transcultural collaboration between Pro Publica, Fundación MEPI, and This American Life, calling it a model for innovative reporting on human rights. Let's take a few minutes to hear a clip from the radio version, What Happened at Dos Eras, from This American Life. It's about 5 minutes.
In addition to the personal stories that we broadcast, more and more over these last few years, we've been doing investigative stories that take months to research and report. For example, we collaborated with the investigative reporting team at Pro Publica on this story, which begins with this guy named Oscar Ramirez. He grew up in Guatemala and moved to the United States. He'd been here for about a dozen years when he got a phone call from a war crimes prosecutor in Guatemala. And she told him that when he was 3 years old, soldiers murdered everyone in a tiny town called Dos Eras, everybody except for 2 little boys. And she thought that he was one of those 2 boys. Oscar says that he was sure that she must have the wrong person. He had never heard of this town. He'd had a happy childhood, he thought.
I was confused. I didn't know what she was talking about. But she said, I know you don't know much about it, or you probably don't know anything about it. Because I was quiet. I was just listening to what she's saying.
So they do a DNA test. And sure enough, the man that Oscar thought was his father, who raised him as a son, was not his father, but in fact was the second in command of this army squad that killed his whole family and 200 people, his whole village. And there was more news. His real father was alive. They found him living in the jungle.
Mi nombre es Tranquilino Castañeda Valenzuela.
My name is Tranquilino Castañeda Valenzuela.
So here's a bit of this part of that story. The reporter for this story is Habiba Noshin.
Tranquilino's pregnant wife was killed at Dos Eras, along with all of his children, 9 of them, or so he thought. For 30 years, he's lived alone in the jungle. He never remarried after the massacre, never had another child. And in the middle of our interview, Tranquilino interrupted with a request.
Ahora puedo dar el nombre de los hijos también.
Can I give the name of my children?
Of course.
Esther Castañeda.
My firstborn was Esther Castañeda.
Etelvina.
The second one was Etelvina.
Enma.
Enma was the third.
De ahí estaba Maribel.
After that was Maribel.
Ella tenía 13 años
She
cuando
was
murió.
around 13 when she died.
Uno se llamaba Luz Antonio. De los mismos apellidos.
Then it was Luz Antonio, part of my sons.
De ahí estaba César.
Then it was Cesar.
César tenía 7.
Cesar was 7 years old.
Y de ahí vinieron otras 2 hembritas.
Then 2 other girls.
Odilia.
Odilia.
Rosalba.
And Rosalba.
Anyone else?
Sí. Alfredo.
Alfredo was Oscar's given name. Tranquilino was out of town when Dos Eras happened, visiting relatives. When he learned about the massacre, that everyone, including his wife and kids, had been killed.
Yo me sobé de una vez del pensamiento.
Well, I got all crazy.
Mire, mi situación es grande.
Listen, I started to drink.
Yo pensé ahogar las penas y que si podían nadar.
I thought I could drown all my sorrows. But then I figured out that my sorrows could swim.
Radio just doesn't get any richer than that. So, from this team, they're all here. Sebastian Rotella, senior reporter from Pro Publica, mostly all here. Christia Kelman-Schmidt, deputy editor, is not here. Ana Arana, reporter from Fundación MEPI, Mexico City. Brian Reed, and Habiba Noshin. Come on, folks. A few quick words, and go on with more time to talk later.
I'll let Anna and Sebastian speak for the print piece. I just have to, I think it's a privilege to work with such amazing journalists that I've had the pleasure of working with on this team. Brian Reed, who is, on the 20th night of an all-nighter, I went home and my husband said, "How is this piece going?" And I said to him, "I think I'm getting old. I can't keep up with Brian." And, he's just so exceptional as a producer, and I'm so excited to see other work that he does in the future. And Anna, who was, we can't thank her enough for bringing the story to us and allowing us to be a part of this. And Sebastian, who's just, who's amazing, and his skills as a veteran journalist in Latin America was absolutely instrumental in bringing this story together. And, our editors at Pro Publica, who were, instrumental in the print piece. But, I have to say, when I first went to This American Life to pitch the story, I was absolutely terrified because I thought they would say, "Wait a minute, you want an hour on a story in a foreign language that you don't even speak?" And, they took a chance on the story. And, Ira, Nancy, and Julie were just amazing editors. And I especially want to thank the people who shared their stories with us. I mean, just listening to this clip, I remember being back in Guatemala and talking to Tranquilino, people who were brave enough to, and just trusted us enough to visit those really, really traumatic moments. And some people in the story who spoke to us at grave risk to their personal lives. So we really thank them for that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege. I really want to thank the Dart Center and the Columbia University School of Journalism. I want to thank Anna, Habiba, and Brian. I think they, as I feel that this was a story that when we sort of confronted it, it was humbling. It was such a challenge to try and do this story justice, and it was a great responsibility. The organization where I work, Pro Publica, is about its mission is investigative journalism in the public interest, and it seeks justice and accountability. And, you know, we had conversations about whether this was a Pro Publica story or not for a while, and of course it was. And of course it was a story that had to be done. And as Habiba said, I think the most important thing is to thank all the people who talked to us, some of them at risk, all of them dealing with great traumas, the victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, and above all, Oscar, who's an extraordinary guy, and was incredibly generous and gracious and took time to sit down and share this with us. So I really want to thank him. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to thank my wife, Carmen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. These people are wonderful. All right, fine. There will be much more from these folks. Thank you. And again, extraordinary radio. We're now going to take a 5-minute break, in which time you should have wine and non-wine, if you prefer non-wine, and in which time you should have food. We're going to reconfigure the room a little bit, and then begin this series of 2 conversations. The first with our Los Angeles Times and New York team, and then the second with Finding Oscar and with At War. Our first group of DART Award winners tonight are from, on my far right, the York Record and our colleagues from the LA Times. Davian's story for the LA Times, Story Behind These Hands for the York Record. I've put them together because both involve actually a roughly similar period of time, a 5-year aftermath, several year aftermath, and longer, but to a single event, a single shooting that continues to resonate in the lives of victims and of community, stories that involve choices by citizens, the impact on their lives in the face of a bullet, community impact, but also difficult editorial commitments and choices by these news organizations. I think I want to start out actually talking a little bit about the story behind these hands, York Record. And Scott, maybe start with you. I know, just given the timing, I couldn't help but think about Sandy Hook. So many similarities. A school that is deeply traumatized, a principal who dies, and of course we're following it out over years, and also a mysterious turn in the personality of a shooter, an event that people don't sort of fully understand, but also a small town where a journalist, a local journalist, faces a very complicated set of choices in deciding to pursue a story in the first place and then deciding what route to take. Can you talk a little bit about the editorial decisions, why it was that the paper made this kind of a narrative, why you decided to look at the kind of complex and seemingly contradictory reactions of so many people instead of a standard anniversary story or something like that? How did it happen?
We didn't set out to do it in the normal sense that you might think. We had been obviously covering aspects of the aftermath of that shooting for the years since it happened, and we always felt that there were members of the community there, the school community and the community who wanted it put away and who didn't want to talk about it and didn't want others to talk about it. And we always felt that there were people in that community who did want to talk about it and maybe needed to talk about it. And so we kind of always had the feeling that story was there. And we then in the summer before the story published, independently, 2 people who were there at the time approached staffers and said, basically, we need to talk about this. We have stories to tell. It's not okay that other people in the community are saying that we shouldn't talk about this. We don't want to be spoken for in that way. And so we knew right there that we had two people who were willing to share that. And the decision, I think, was to not stop at the two, and to say, if there are two, there are more, and we should do our best to find out how many more and how many different stories there are, because everyone's is different. And
Sorry.
I think
My apologies, everyone.
you could probably talk to 25 people and you wouldn't get every story, you know. So we made the decision at that point, and this was, Jason mentioned the work that Bill Landauer did on it. He started to create that list of people from who were classmates or who would have been in the cafeteria at that time, and began the door-to-door along with Jason, and just methodically we sort of decided we're going to do this. And I remember, and one of the things, and I love what Molly said about, you know, smaller papers or papers without the huge staff size going after this kind of stuff, because I remember Bill saying to me early in one of our meetings, he just looked at me and he said, because I think he was beginning to sense the scope of what he could be getting into, and he said, if I start to find people who are willing to talk, you know, how deep are we willing to go with this? Meaning, am I going to have the time to do this? Are we going to really commit? And I said to him, if you start finding people, this is the story we want to tell. We know it's there, and we have to go tell it. So go and do it. And he did, and they did. So that was the path.
And Jason, you went out on these excursions trying to find survivors of this moment of terror who are willing to look back. As a visual journalist, you're always in the interesting position of needing to gain people's trust. How did that work in this case? I mean, the photos that you took are filled with dignity. They're very striking portraits of folks. But this is about an event that is probably still the most important thing and the most distressing event in most of these people's lives. How did the two of you go about it, and what was the visual piece in particular?
I think I caused my visual editor a lot of heart attacks, because it was probably at least a good month and a half before I even clicked the frame. I mean, we would literally knock on doors, people would be there, and I would leave my gear in the car, and what we would do is start a conversation. And a lot of times it was about people knowing what we were looking to do here, you know, where we were looking to go. And I knew that people were afraid to talk. You know, pressures from former teachers or pressures from, you know, administration who were telling them to keep their mouths shut. I mean, once word got out that we were knocking on doors, and in that town it got around pretty fast. You know, the father of the victim, of the boy who shot the principal, that's an interesting story. I mean, really quickly, we went to the house to talk to them after we had gained some information, and again, left my gear in the car. The mother answers the door. We explained to her who we are and what we're doing. And the gist was that these people came to us and said, we're still in pain. A lot of the community is still in pain, but they don't want to talk about it. So the idea at first, before we approached these parents, was to get a scope of how much of this was true. And we found a range where there were some who it was a horrible day, but it was past, and others who were in another classroom and still have trouble sleeping. If a balloon pops, they freak out. So we gathered as much as we could at that point and then approached the parents. The mother brought us in, which surprised me. The father is sitting in a chair, and he's not even looking at us. And he's looking forward at the television, and the mother sits here on the couch. Bill sits there, and I decide to sit back here because I wanted to observe their body language of Bill. Now, I don't have my camera with me because I'm thinking, I'm just thrilled to be in this house at this point. So Bill talks, literally starts to get 2 minutes into it, and as soon as he says, we started to talk to the community, like a switch went off. The father got up and finally acknowledged us and said, I know you've been talking to people. I know that you've been talking, we've been hearing about it all. And then the mother was trying to calm him down. She said, calm down, and he just started getting more elevated. And I said, sir, the reason we didn't come to you right away is because I tried to explain to him that we wanted to make sure that we had this information to present to him. And he said, bullshit. And I said, okay. And he said, get out. And we said, okay. And his wife started to cry. And he said, look, you're making my wife cry. And we said, we apologize, and we left. And a lot of times, conversations with anyone we went to would be the only time. They talk to us, and then we'd call or text or show up again, and they were like ghosts, you know. And a technique that we used, like I said, which frustrated my editor, was I needed to gain that trust first to people who were willing to talk to us before I would bring the camera out. And even after people promised us that they would have their photo taken, even after I knocked on doors and texted and went to their work and went to their parents' house and had parents tell us, please leave our children alone, children being 23-year-olds, please leave our child alone, having people call the police, we said, you know, what kept us moving forward was, honestly, it was the belief. I believe in two things. I believe in duct tape, and I believe in journalism. And I believe that, done well, it can help people. It can make a difference. And we knew going into this, when the story ran, there was going to be people who would see this and go, I can talk. And there was going to be people who were going to be, who this was going to bring more pain to. But the hope was that it would start a conversation.
And talk a little, either one of you, both of you, about where that conversation went, both as your reporting was going on and then when the story was published. You're breaking silence in a way, and the story, you know, quotes a teacher, quotes others saying, we've been silenced, but we're feeling this pain. How did that play out in the community as the story was published?
Jason might have some stories to tell as well, but I think after, in previous years, if we were to do an anniversary type story or just a news story because there was something else in the news that might have brought the Red Lion story back into the news or some such, we would pretty consistently get that pushback from people in the community. Why do you keep bringing this up? Leave us alone. Nobody wants to talk about this anymore. You keep going back to it. Why are you so fascinated with it? And that kind of feedback. After this story was the first time that the public had heard from some of the people who were students at the time. And we got some feedback from other students saying, essentially, thanks for finally telling our story. We've been hearing adults speak for us for years about this, and thank you for giving us a voice in this. That was really gratifying, I think, to us. We did get some of the other, too. You know, again, you're going back to this story, leave us alone. But we knew that it had an impact on the students who were there at the time, who, if you think about it, were 12 or 13 and at the age when their parents pretty much and the adults in their lives are pretty much, they're running the show, you know. I mean, they're speaking for them, but they've been dealing with this for 9 or 10 years, and they, some of them, we heard them say, thanks for giving us a voice, which we felt good about, because that's the impact I think that we were hoping to have with it.
Yeah. But Molly and Barbara, I mean, you two were dealing with a breaking of silence, though it's a different kind of silence, and we saw some of that in the video, all the people who say, well, I don't want to be involved, I don't want to be involved. And then Davian himself, who decides in the course of the story varying levels of testimony and disclosure that he has to give. How did you decide on that as the theme of your piece? How did that emerge? It's so striking and present.
The theme of, I'm sorry,
a lot of it revolves around his decision to testify and the various stages he goes through along the way.
Well, just quick, you want me to take it?
Yeah, please.
Just quickly, this story started, I'll assume some of you maybe haven't read it. That's okay. I'm gonna rope you in. It started when I was working on the morning shift, and I'm saying that for a reason. The early morning shift, breaking news, it was a lot of writing for the web. I would come in at 6 or 7 in the morning, 5 days a week, and just be, covering what was breaking until usually like way past the technical end of my day. And a lot of times I think I hear people say, well, I can't do these kinds of stories, narrative stories or longer term stories. My editor won't give me time to do it. And I'm gonna totally kind of screw you over by saying, my editor in the beginning did not really give me time to do it. I said, I think this is an interesting story. I think it should, after I came across Davian in the course of just reporting on the initial shooting, I think it's worth maybe a longer, like a weekend piece. And then I just started stringing it out and saying, I think maybe it's worth something more. And then, can I have a little time here and there? But I was still, I wasn't, taken off my beat. I didn't have time set aside. I went from the morning shift to covering county government, which can be pretty demanding in Los Angeles County, which is kind of the size of a lot of other states. Then I was the medical reporter. Then I did foreign rotations. And by the end of it, I was a national correspondent based in Houston, which made it kind of hard to cover trial in LA. But I made time. A lot of it was, and I'm sure some of the other reporters who are here can relate to this, it was working on weekends, it was working after hours, it was like you guys were describing, building trust with people by showing up at church on the weekends and at school for after-school activities like football games. So over the course of that, you peel away the layers and you go from the superficial story, which could have been the Weekender, to the much better story of, and this came pretty late in the game, actually. If you read the story, there's some spoilers in here, but Davian goes into protective custody, what they call protective custody, but you guys know is probably as witness protection. And I had worked so hard to get to know the DA who was handling the case, and she was telling me all this stuff, that she, most DAs wouldn't have told me, and, the sheriffs and so forth, and then he just drops off the map. And we could have lost the story at that point. And there was silence, his cell phone was cut off, no contact. And then one day, out of the blue, I get a call from him. I was so grateful. And he said, Molly, I'm here and I have so much to tell you. Can you meet me at the mall? And so I met him in a food court. This was after months of not talking to him. And another layer came away and he started revealing stuff about his family, which he had not told me before. And we knew that he was holding back stuff. And I guess it's sort of like you guys talking about not bringing your gear in the house. We were not pressing on certain things, knowing that we had more time because we had agreed not to run the story until after the trial. But that was definitely a point of demarcation where more got revealed. I did just want to mention one other thing in terms of relating to things that other reporters go through. And I just coming in here, I did want to give a message of hope to people, both people who feel like they don't have enough time and also people who feel like they suffer major setbacks. I don't even know if you know about this, Barbara. There was a point where I had been keeping all my stuff on this story in a like a milk crate next to my desk. And I came back one day to my desk having been out reporting, and found the milk crate empty. Huh. And I very calmly went and asked the office manager, what's going on? And she gave me this sort of, dismissive look and said, well, we're doing office cleaning, and they, threw it away. And I said, very calmly, really? And my editor can attest to this, I was pretty calm. Really, where did they throw it away? And she said, oh, I don't know, it's probably in the trash compactor by now. So I very calmly, with my reporter, what would you guys do? So I'm like, okay, well, who would know? Well, maybe Carlos, the janitor. So I went down into the bowels of the Los Angeles Times building, and I met Carlos, the janitor. And he said, yeah, it probably is in the trash compactor. And I said, well, let's go see the trash compactor. And so we went. We went in the trash compactor. And it was like about the size of a good size like dumpster. I don't know if I didn't know how trash compactors
I think you
work.
should save this for the screenplay. This is just...
Well, at the end of it, it pushes in. So anyway, we climbed in, and I was pulling stuff out, and it was the size of, like I said, a big dumpster, so it could have been anywhere in there. But it was on the end. My notes were on the end. And I started pulling them out, and another Bill janitor came over and said, get out of there, it's still plugged in. So he said he unplugged it. And I got pretty much all of my notes back. And they all the editors in the office already know this, and they're always like, Molly's the one who went into the trash compactor she never loses hope. But don't lose hope. That's my message.
Barbara, let me ask you something about
I had to
images.
tell a funny
Yeah.
story because it's pretty
well,
heavy. The rest
well,
of it
and
is
this
pretty
actually
heavy.
relates to what I'm going to ask you. So this is a very dark story.
Mm.
It's about a story that commences with an act of immense violence in a community that suffers immense and ongoing violence, that struggles with immense and ongoing violence. And it's a very interior story as well about Davian's own inner reflections on testimony or forgiveness, on protecting himself versus doing the right thing, on loyalty versus whatever. You made some interesting visual choices here. You shoot all in black and white. Their pictures are have a certain look. Talk about how you decided to approach this kind of a subject.
Okay. This particular story was very difficult for me to tell, not only because there were huge access issues. It was more about me being the journalist and photographing this young man who was deciding to testify against a gang member who shot him. That comes with serious consequences. So I was always worried about this retaliation factor. It always troubled me. I would not want to be a part of the story, then I'd come back and be a part of the story, and then I wouldn't want to be a part of the story because I was just struggling with it so much. What if my photos led to something happening to Davian? And I really struggled with that. I'd spoken to him several times about it in the hopes that he could convince me that this was the right thing and I should continue to do this. I mean, it's one thing when you're talking, it's another thing when you physically have their face out there for all to see. And coincidentally, at the time, it was the start of a very long-term commitment on my part of documenting innocent victims of gang violence. So Davian became one of the many stories at the time that I was telling. So I was completely and fully entrenched on the long-term stories of people that this happens to. So it was very much a part of my daily existence as a journalist. And you know, you're dealing with so much pain and grief from the people you're documenting that at times you do struggle with going forward and trying to ensure that you cover them with dignity and safety so that nothing happens to them. So it was definitely challenging. I think, you know, initially Molly and I had decided that we would go and speak to the family and basically be right up front, not bring the cameras, and sort of vocalize what we were hoping to achieve with this story and the type of access I would have to say to really give an in-depth look at the struggle and the journey of this young man. And really unbeknownst to us at the time, we suspected that there were some things going on in the house that really weren't probably the best for Davian. So my access was shut down. You know, I was up front saying what we would like to do, and basically the visual access was shut down for a lot of the journey through this piece.
And how, just one other thing, and then we can take one or two questions from the floor if anyone has any questions. When you talk about covering your protagonist with dignity, what kinds of choices did you make visually to do that in this case?
You know, I think the psyches of the people you're covering are so fragile. They are truly at an incredibly vulnerable point in their life. They've just been incredibly traumatized. Davian was a 16-year-old kid running around playing basketball, working at his church, and then the next day, he was no longer able to walk. Yeah. So it's a pretty dramatic change in a teenager's life, in anyone's life. So you have to be mindful in what choices you decide to photograph. What is appropriate for the longer term story building of this particular tale? You know, is this image exploitive? Do we really need this aspect? You know, you have to be cognizant of what it is that you want to say, because as journalists we have so much power. And when we're covering disenfranchised communities and people of violence, we have to be very sensitive about that and ensure that the victims are the star of the show. And really, we take the back seat and just try to document what we see playing out as it plays out.
Well, and part of it was he was 16. That's part of what you're alluding to. He was 16 when it started, so there were issues around him being a minor and him saying he was okay with something and really understanding. But I also, if I could just note, because you're not going to necessarily say this, the work that Barbara's talking about, stray bullets, I would encourage a lot of people to look at that. But she, just go ahead and tell them.
Well, like Molly, a lot of these stories you have to fight for within the newsroom. And it's not just because we work at a large newspaper that, automatically our editors say, okay, here it is. Go take 5 years to tell this tale. It just doesn't happen. And so I think there has to be a real commitment on the reporter, the photographer, the producers to do these stories in between your daily assignments, which happened to me and still does. And I worked very hard and long on this subject matter, and it won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for our victims of gang violence that we did. And Molly continued with her story, and it ran last year, and it was a real privilege to be able to, the drama that played out in the newsroom, in the courtroom.
Yeah.
That was a Freudian slip.
We'll
discuss that at dinner.
Could I just add one thing about that? I'm sorry. I don't mean to go on so long. Yeah, it was the newsroom.
The courtroom.
But I have some members of my family are here, and they'll remember this. But this was a piece. It ended up being a piece of stray bullets. Do you remember Rashawn? The woman.
Yes.
Yeah. So this just to say, I mean, I know sometimes the gang issue, it becomes this sort of caricature of LA, but gang violence really does touch everyone's lives. And I had done this thing called Centurion training. I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but hazardous environment training that people do generally to do foreign rotations, because I had gone to Iraq a couple times. And I was just working a regular weekend metro shift in LA. I had gone down to Imperial Highway in South LA to the scene of where they had a little shrine for someone who had just been shot the night before. It was an officer-involved shooting with a sheriff's deputy and a guy who, the memorial had all this pale blue stuff on it, so you can make your assumptions of what this guy's associations were. And I was hanging out there, and I had walked maybe like a half block away when I heard a sound that sounded like firecrackers. And I turned around, and I immediately got on the phone and said to my editor as I was walking across the street, you could read, I wrote a story about it, that there were bodies on the ground. And I said to my editor, I think I may be the only person around here who knows first aid. I got to go. And she freaked out. But one of the first person I came upon, Rashawn Williams, I ended up helping, and Barbara photographed us for this story. I ended up writing about it. But and that was in the course of still doing the Davian story and doing everything else. So I think a lot of us, those of us who've worked in LA or have family in LA or the LA area, you feel a piece of this. It affects you. And the work that Barbara did also on stray bullets, I think, gets at that.
So time for one or two questions. There's a microphone up back if there's anyone who would like to, or it'll come a little less up back if Ariel will move it, if there's anyone who would like to grab it and ask something. Just identify yourself, and this is being videotaped. It will eventually be on the Dart Center website, so don't embarrass yourself, your family, or your neighbors.
My name is Chandrakant Pancholi, and I want to know what happens to your emotional side when you are covering this type of events, right? There is human tragedy going on. And secondly, how cooperative these government agencies and police department and DA are when you want to interview people.
Let's focus on that first one, and maybe if Scott and Jason, you could talk about that in your local paper, and you guys talk about how did you deal with the impact on the staff, if any, and how did it play out?
One of the things I feel truly blessed about in terms of what we do is what we do here gives me perspective. It allows me to see, how someone's life is and compared to my own, and it allows me to feel, if anything, gratitude for what I have and gratitude for who I am. And so, I'll spend a day with a man who is a quadruple amputee and tells me that he's blessed, or a woman who has MS and cancer and just thanks God. And I spend time with these kids who have been through something, but they share with us. And I'm grateful, and I'm appreciative. And the one thing I always say to people when we're asking them to allow us into their lives is that I never take that for granted.
Scott, you're a manager. Did you worry at all about the capacity of your staff or the effect this immersion might have on them?
Not as much in this story, I don't think, as we've actually had some people recently go help out with our parent company's coverage in Newtown and Boston, and that's a much more immediate thing. I think we had a lot of conversations. Jason and I have worked together for a long time, and Bill was newer, but we had a team, and I think the conversations that we had, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the conversations...
You're wrong.
I think the conversations that we had about the story helped form sort of a bedrock that we all knew what we wanted to try to do and why we were doing it. And so there was sort of that mutual support when they'd get a door slammed in their face, or when they would, when we would hear from people, just leave us alone. And we had a lot of conversations, and Jason and Bill had this story in here from the beginning, and it never left. And I knew that, it was clear as day to me. So when they would come and say, this person said they would talk, and we were really hopeful this could be a key person in the story, but then we went back and he didn't seem like he really wanted to, and then now we can't reach him. We would have these discussions about how hard should we push, and I think we were all together on we can't, we didn't feel like we could push somebody to talk who was going through this decision of, I wanted to, but now I don't think I do, and so we tried to support. I guess that there was an emotional part of that, component of that for us to deal with, and I think we supported each other.
And really quick, I'm sorry, not to, as a reporter, photographer team, we spent a lot of time in the car, hours. I mean, and so when things were happening and we'd leave a scene feeling horrible, or we'd leave a scene feeling like we accomplished something, there's always a discussion going on. Bill and I, in addition to being colleagues, were friends. So if something was going on, we could talk through it. And if it wasn't anything that we could talk through, the Daily Record has an incredible environment in it that I could go to Scott and say, look, this is getting to me. Or I can go to my other editors and say, look, this is frustrating me. And there was never a closed door, and there's always an environment where I can kind of cut loose. And I'm also just lucky to have a family who's understandable about when you devote yourself to a project or to time that, I'm going to come home and I'm going to want to talk about it or not want to talk about it.
What about you guys? Any thoughts on the emotional consequences of this story, or the work like it?
Well, I sort of wanted to make a note because we've been talking about these mass shootings, and I think there's sort of different circumstances. I am fresh off of covering Boston. I was at Newtown, I was at Oak Creek, I was at Aurora, I was at Tucson, and I was at Virginia Tech, covering all of them. And by choice. I mean, I would have felt really left out if I had not been there. I really wanted to be there. And as you all can see, I have no emotional side. But I was glad that I was there, and I wouldn't say, it was my job to be there, and it was my job to be somewhat emotional and to be sensitive, but also I am pushy as a reporter. I know that I am. I am incredible. I had an editor once called me bird dog. But people look back and they said, some of the people I talked to said, I'm so glad that you got me to talk about that. It was a little bit therapeutic for me. It was good to have someone I could talk to who was not a member of my family, who couldn't take it anymore. Or, I remember doing one interview in Aurora, talking to a father who had lost his daughter, and the mother was sitting there, and she would talk a little bit and be totally normal, and then she would go into the other room and sob uncontrollably, and then she would come back again and talk. And she didn't want me to leave. She didn't ask me to leave. And I was really glad that I was there. So I think, I read your story, and I was very interested at the choice to include the stuff about the people who didn't want to talk and why they didn't want to talk. And I think it gave a much sort of truer picture of the environment, But I know a lot of times with these mass shootings, people say, it's too soon and you're pushing so much and why is there this insatiable appetite? But I think it is in other cases, like in the mass shooting cases, I think it is good to get a lot of stuff down in real time because it's a historical record.
Well, I think that's Barbara, if you have a quick thing, and then we're going to have to just
I'll just quickly add that often when you're working on in-depth projects, you're not there in the capacity. The event is not a spot news event. So you're not in a pack with a bunch of journalists and a bunch of photographers and how poorly they portray us on television. That's really what we are. So when you do the longer term stories, it's really just you and the family that you're documenting. So you develop an incredibly close bond. There's no two ways about it. And you walk alongside them through their journey of sadness and horror and post-traumatic stress and frustration and figuring out how they're going to get their life back on track. So inevitably, it's going to impact you. But I think it's a much more honest way of covering these kinds of stories, as instead of going to these mass shootings. I mean, I've covered all of that as well. But when you really spend the time with the people you're documenting, that's the best kind of journalism you could possibly do. And that's when you get to go deep, and it really matters and counts.
Well, I think that's a lovely place to end. Thank you. Let's do a very quick rotation. Don't even take a break. Stay where you are. Team Oscar at war, come up. All right. I've clustered these two pieces, Finding Oscar and its various forms, and the At War blog together, partly because they're both about war, but also because they're both in different ways about conflict, atrocity, and the chickens coming home to roost eventually. And I think, Thomas, if you don't mind, because you're starting as an individual, I want to start out there. I'm going to start by reading a little quote from your blog and then ask you something about it. You say at one point, as a leader I was strong, but as an individual I began to fall apart. And you go on to lay out what's been happening to you. And you go on to talk about, you say the killing necessarily changes people. And you go on to talk about this. You're a blogger. You're writing in the first person. You're also a Marine. And you're a product of that culture and those commitments. What made you decide to reveal yourself in this particular way? Not to write about PTSD as an abstract issue, but to show us so much of yourself. What led you to that?
I think I didn't want to feel alone, and I didn't want other people to feel alone. The biggest issue that I see with the military is that nobody talks, and that everybody stays silent. And I think a lot of it was to shine light on PTSD, even though you asked me, I don't know. But I wanted everybody to feel like they had somebody else going through it with them, and that their voice could be heard if they wanted to talk. Like that was my driving force behind writing and showing myself.
Did you worry about what your both immediate former comrades and the larger community of the Marine Corps and the military would think?
I knew I was violating social norms by opening my mouth and writing what I wrote. But I mean, I'd watch the news, and very rarely you'd see something on Afghanistan. Very rarely you'd see something, Iraq was winding down and we were getting out of there. But, I mean, just complete and utter silence for what veterans go through. So I think I lost track of your question.
I think you answered the question.
I'll blame that on my brain injury. Yeah, it just, no veterans issues on the news. I mean, you don't hear, like I said earlier, you don't hear about the 22 veterans a day that commit suicide. You don't hear about the troops that commit suicide every day. And they can't be alone. And me personally experienced a lot of backlash from my superiors for airing the Corps' dirty laundry, as they like to call it. But it was worth every single tongue lashing I got if it helped one person.
James, you have the enviable job for any editor of editing a great writer, right? But it's also the challenging job of editing someone who is negotiating all of these issues, struggling to make decisions about silence versus speaking and when to shut up and when not to shut up. Also, a lot of us as editors have a kind of double mission. On the one hand, we're trying to get the most compelling piece of writing we can, and on the other hand, we sometimes worry about the consequences of that writing, if it's especially revelatory, for the folks we're publishing. How do you negotiate this relationship, and how do you see your responsibilities as an editor here?
Well, it's interesting because I'll be honest with you. I don't think I think probably one of my first questions to Thomas was, have you checked with anyone about whether it's okay with them if we publish this? Because the At War blog is, it's a tiny blog, but it does get read in the Pentagon, and it gets passed around in their various, in their various media packages. But anyone who's ever spent any time with Marines or covered the Marines kind of knows that they often, one of the great delights of dealing with them, if you're a journalist, is they kind of just do what they want to do sometimes. And are pretty straightforward and forthright about it. And Thomas, as I recall, was, I don't even know if you checked with anybody, but you didn't seem worried about it, and that was good enough for me, quite honestly. It was, and there wasn't, I mean, part of what, most of what I do with the blog is I handle active duty and veteran writers like Thomas, and and some of them can write and some of them cannot. And what was so great was Thomas was writing on a theme that many veterans write about, but it was so direct and clearly written and powerful that to me, the moment he said he wasn't worried about it, I was ready to publish it.
And Thomas, let me ask you one other thing. I mean, the stigma and censorship from the Marine Corps or War One's buddies is one thing, and it takes a lot of courage to face that. But then there's also the internal censor, the person sitting on our shoulder saying, "Don't say that." Was there a point among the stuff that has been published in which you confronted something that you really you found yourself saying, "I don't want to write about this, but I have to"?
My piece about what it's like to kill someone, I definitely struggled with that because I didn't want to come off like I was some hardcore warrior or a malicious killer or anything along those lines. I wanted it to come off as something that has to be done in war, and the consequences are something that every veteran brings home from war. So I had to walk a very fine line when I wrote that to where I didn't sound bad and I wasn't building myself up to be something that I wasn't. And I'll let the future unfold what I'm writing now, but it's the hardest one yet.
Okay.
So.
Well, good. Let's talk about the Finding Oscar project a bit, and then again we'll have some time for a couple of questions. Anna, why don't you talk about how this story began? Because you were sort of the beginning of this, right?
Yeah. Well, this kind of story, as most journalists and the ones who are journalists here, is journalists tend to be selfish with their stories. And I'm at a different process now where we're doing different things, and this was, I think, the pinnacle of it on what we started to do, which is that there are certain stories and a lot of stories in the future that need to be told in multiple platforms and with bigger people than you are. We're very tiny. We're like 4 people. We grow to 10 sometimes. We're 5. I have different levels of, experiences and everything. And we had been working with a Guatemalan newspaper on other stories, and I wrote to an old source, and I sent him a copy of the story. And he said, "I have a great story for you, Anna." And so I came to New York, and he basically said, there's this kid here who survived a massacre, but I'm going to give it to the New York Times. And I said, no, that'll be a one-day story. Let me handle it. And he said, so who's this Pro Publica? I said, well, here, I'll give you. You go find out. And so, I basically, he was going to come today. The relationship with this source is such that he's a human rights, he's a big-time lawyer, but he's a human rights pro bono guy who has handled a lot of the major Central American and Latin American cases in the last 20 years. So he understands how he works. He has preferred journalists that he works with. But we managed to sort of convince him to bring this together. And so the story was, it's about war, but it's about war after the fact in a place that has never come to terms with going after the guilty people and where everything has been swept under the carpet and where people who order the war now run organized crime, and that's why they continue. All these countries continue to be destroyed. And it's not because they don't work. It's because the guys who killed people before now run the money. And so, and those are the harder stories to do because you got to prove them. And so, so this was a way of sort of getting into that. And when we did the story with this amazing team, that didn't work all the time well because we were all very separate individuals, right, and different ways of doing it. But we were all in the point of it that it was the only way to tell the story. It didn't belong to us. It was a story for the world to hear.
We heard that remarkable moment, and maybe Habiba, you can talk about this, in which Oscar's father begins to just give this litany of the names of his massacred children. Sebastian or Habiba, either one of you, talk about how that moment came about. It's really unusual radio and unusual journalism.
Ana had met Tranquilino before Brian and I went to Guatemala to meet him, and Ana had said he doesn't really remember much of what had happened. He's tried to block it out as a way to sort of deal with it. So that's how we were going into it, thinking that he's not going to really remember much of this, and it was tough. We were struggling with how to even approach him delicately. He showed up that day. You could tell he had been drinking, and it's a strange thing to interview a subject on such a traumatic event when they've been drinking, and you're like asking yourself all these questions. And so in the middle, we sit down, we were talking about something totally different, about chickens and how things he had in his farm, like just something, and he interrupts and he asks to list his children's name, and that was a moment that was hard to be in that moment because you realize he does remember all these children, and after that, shortly after, he actually broke down and he stopped the interview. And it was tough to be there and to experience that, but not just for yourself. It's tough for him to actually relive that, and as he says in the piece, he had buried that by drinking, and that was his way to cope, and to have to be told 30 years later that somebody who you've been mourning for 30 years is actually alive. I mean, can't imagine what that's like.
And Sebastian, you know a lot of the history of the Civil War. You had covered that region, yeah? What did you find yourself bringing to what would have been, a challenging investigation under any circumstances?
Well, it's interesting because I had covered Latin America very in depth, less Central America. I'd done stories related to Central America. I'd done a lot in South America. And in Mexico and at the Mexican border, I'd covered massacres, I'd covered drug wars, I'd cover a case very much like this in Argentina, which was actually very helpful, about a girl who found out when she was 10, in a situation something like Oscar, that the people who had brought her up were actually the people who had either killed or been involved in the killing of her real parents, and her life had been a lie. I found the great struggle, and I'm sure my colleagues will agree, in a story like this and those kinds of stories is balance, because for an American audience in particular, you don't want to sugarcoat it. You don't want to underplay it in the writing of it. And I've had this experience both in writing nonfiction and fiction, you also don't want to there's a certain restraint. Otherwise, it just becomes lurid and melodramatic and almost pornographic, right? And I think that was the thing. I mean, one of the things, and I was very thankful to the editors at Pro Publica, Steve Engelberg and Tom Detzel, one of the things they pushed me to do what usually editors try and pull you away from, which is, you know, kind of a literary nonfiction approach. So, for example, we didn't use standard journalistic attributions. There aren't a lot of sort of, we had source notes in the margins. So you could see that it was all, thanks to this team, you know, very, very robustly documented and reported. But the narrative, we try to tell it very straightforwardly, very much like the powerful tale that it was, and not even a lot of quotes, you know, or not standard quotes, reproductions of dialogue, which again was based on the reporting. And I think all that was trying to get at the power of this and trying to strike that balance by making the writing as controlled and precise and powerful, but understated as possible.
And Brian, let me ask you something about the radio piece. I mean, This American Life always tells interesting and sometimes complicated stories. But even by those standards, this is extraordinary and epic. It's a very complex story with lots of characters. It's got big facts, big history behind it, events both small and large that are hard to listen to and hard to look at, and a little bit unbelievable almost, some of the coincidences in the story. How do you take something that is both horrifying with a long historic sweep and complex and yet so intimate in the life of its characters and make it work for radio? What are the choices that radio faced here?
I think we answered that question in our first edit. The way you edit a radio story, at least at our show, is you sit down and you perform the story. You read it aloud and fire the tape off where it goes, and it's 2 hours long, and people sit in a room and listen to it and furiously scribble throughout the whole thing. And so our first edit was like 1 hour and 45 minutes long, probably. And the structure of the story was completely reversed. The second act was the first act.
And remind folks.
So essentially, for the most part, basically the second act, the first act was the story of Oscar getting this news about this prosecutor's suspicion that he may have been abducted from this massacre. And then it went into explaining why she had this suspicion, which basically involved 2 of the soldiers who were at the massacre telling the story of the massacre, which is incredibly difficult to hear. It's just, the things that happen there are really, really horrible and unimaginable. And then the second act was years later, 15 years later and onwards, investigators, human rights investigators and prosecutors trying to figure out what happened 15 years earlier. So that was the original structure. And in the first edit, we got to the part of the massacre and it was pornographic. It was, how do we justify hearing all of these horrible, horrible things happening? You don't have a desire to hear them on the radio at this point. And so we figured out with the help of our awesome editors that you could take the second act, which was a mystery, which was investigators trying to figure out what happened, and put it earlier. And that way you're invested in wanting to know what happened. And so eventually at the point in the story where the investigators get a break and a soldier who's at the massacre becomes the first soldier in Guatemala to come forward and talk about one of these events, your appetite is whetted and you're invested in the story enough we'd earned it basically as storytellers to actually talk about these really horrible things.
And we should say that this story happened to be broadcast and published at a sort of historic moment shortly before General Rios Montt, same week, was indicted and now is on trial for leading those atrocities in the Civil War. Question or two, since there's a microphone here? Anyone? If not, I'll keep going. But yeah, why don't you go up to the mic? And again, just say who you are, and remember, again, we're being recorded for posterity.
I don't embarrass myself. Adriana Larrota, I'm a former recovered journalist, and I do media relations. This is a really relevant story for Latin America, for Central America. And I understand that it has to be dramatized, and that Brian's account is very revealing on how it has to work for the media. But the fact that it is in English and it runs in an American outlet is somehow leaves the story out of bounds to the public or the constituents that should be impacted by this. So my question would be how to take the story beyond, how to impact really reality and make it accessible to the public that is invested in this.
Well, then I'll talk about this because this is where we came in. And the story had been covered a lot in the Guatemalan media, but it was covered episodically. And so people become callous and they just don't want to hear it after a while. I mean, I remember when I went and talked to the local partner we have there, and I said, look, this is a great story. We've done that story. And I said, no, you got to do it in a different way where you deliver a point. And so it was not understood. We did the print piece. The big thing was that it came out in all of Latin America. We had, I can't remember right now, but at least a dozen newspapers published the story in English. In terms of radio, it was a big investment. I mean,
in Spanish. It was published in Spanish.
In Spanish,
yes.
I'm sorry.
Right.
But in terms of radio, we sort of thought about doing it a long-form radio format, which actually, if you think about it, telenovelas were huge on radio, and long narratives were big in the 50s in Latin America. They're not now. And so now you have, as you know well, this is something that was championed in Colombia, and is big in Mexico, and is big in the rest of the country, of Latin America, which is, radio news are very tiny, they're sharp, so they would not go for this long format, although a lot of people are trying to change that. But it was read, it had an impact, it definitely had an impact on Oscar here, and then the fact that it came out first, it was published, in Guatemala it was published as a full supplement by the local paper, that's our partner. So, and then Salvador also ran it. It was all over Central America. So there are kind of stories that people do run, and they do have an impact.
One concrete impact was, in one of the follow-ups, we ran sort of a rogues gallery of all the guys who are still fugitives from the squad, the commandos, and actually got a tip that one of them, though he was technically a fugitive, was the president of the Homeowners Association of a wealthy neighborhood in Guatemala. So you realize that, all of a sudden you feel like you're making at least pushing things toward justice, and all of a sudden things got a little warm for him. So, he's still on the run, but things like that are very gratifying, because the thing about this case was that you could see some movement towards justice, also in U.S. courts as well as in Guatemala. So that was very gratifying.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff means a lot, because the U.S., having a story published in the U.S. still drives a big point in Latin America and places where sometimes...
And let me ask a similar question of James and Thomas. I mean, Thomas, if your goal is to have an impact on the lives of veterans, do either of you kind of think about how to get this in front of the eyes of the Marines and soldiers who need to do it, or do you just kind of trust the magic of the New York Times to do it?
I mean, I know I'm big on self-promotion as far as I would contact Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, which is here in New York. They were huge in publicizing what Jim published for me. And I mean, I've been contacted by colleges who said they make it mandatory reading now for, students in psychology classes, all sorts of different stuff. And, I mean, yeah, a lot of it's the magic of the New York Times, but I mean, just like me pursuing the New York Times, I also pursue getting the word out there that, I'm trying to spread the good word about veterans.
And Jim, in the conception of the At War blog, was it always thought of as having soldiers and vets as an audience, as a core audience? Maybe talk about the conception of that a little bit.
No, that wasn't actually part of the conception. The At War blog was created, I'm trying to remember what year it was probably about 2007, 2008, largely by war correspondents who were in Iraq and had tons of material that they couldn't get into the paper, and the At War blog became a vehicle for them to not to empty notebooks necessarily, but to write things that were perhaps smaller in scope, but vivid and important in some way. And somewhere along, and I was not really intimately involved in it at that time, but somewhere along the way, they started getting, I think it was Steve Farrell in Baghdad, started getting active duty troops who were in the front line to write a little bit about their experiences, and we had a few pieces of that sort. At some point, when I had moved to New York, they asked me to take it over, and I had started writing about Veterans Affairs, and at that point, I sort of just took it upon myself to incorporate more writing by veterans and active duty troops. And as we phased out in Iraq, and now we're phasing out of Afghanistan, much more of what I receive or what I solicit is from people like Thomas who are out. And blogs, as some of you who may pay attention to this stuff are in trouble at the New York Times, are in trouble everywhere, frankly. And one of the arguments I make for sustaining the At War blog is that it does bring it brings a different type of writer into our website. It doesn't go in the paper, but it's on the website. And it also brings a different type of reader to the New York Times, because many of the people who I think look at us and disseminate our stuff are not regular New York Times readers. And it does provide a vehicle not only for people to talk about their issues, but also to see what other people are writing about some of these things. And so I think it's a really useful and important way for the Times to disseminate in a new way, and Facebook and Twitter help as well.
Well, and what we're talking about, I think, with both of these stories, and indeed with all four of the DART Award winners we've heard today, is a kind of journalism that surfaces the voices and stories that usually are not heard from in the first person. Soldiers and veterans, shooting victims over years and communities over years, perpetrators as well, and surviving family members. All of those voices echo through these stories and the stories we heard about earlier today. I think that's as good a place as any to end. I would like to thank everyone up here, our other panelists,